This is someone that I looked up to so much, and that was the only way I knew how to make him happy. Grooming is so fast and so slow all at the same time.
Probably the only guilt I have about this whole thing is that other victims became of it.
This isn't a normal church, no. It's a cult.
Every IFB church is a powder keg ready to explode.
I hate that he was my first everything.
These people are gods.
And they said, we're gonna brainwash you. We're gonna brainwash the junk out of your brain.
Women have to be submissive.
He would say, this cup is poison. Drink it. You were guilt-tripped to swallow goldfish. You had to obey.
This is a training ground for pedophiles and serial rapists.
I invited the wolf with my little lambs.
He drugged me almost every time.
No reasonable person would believe that they are not responsible.
I'm talking about corporal punishment. I'm talking about forced feedings, forced starvations.
Put a finger down if you ever had to eat your own vomit.
You literally are in a box with a bolt-lock door.
There was no way out.
It got bigger and more powerful.
We uncovered 412 allegations.
People are afraid to go up against them.
They threatened to kill you. You will find everything from child abuse, sex abuse, to murder. You're exposing an empire.
It was all lies. The whole church turned a blind eye to the abuse that happened.
None of this was ever your fault.
These people
Will answer for what they did,
I'm not going to be quiet again.
if not on this earth, in front of God.
We will not be silenced. There's so much to tell you about it.
Hey everyone, and welcome to our show tonight. We are going to be doing a live Q&A with the producer, director, and with one of the cast members from this incredibly well done, I can still hear some background noise, this incredibly well done documentary called Let Us Pray, A Ministry of Scandals. You just saw the trailer that we had here of this 4-part series. And I know many in our Courage 365 audience have already watched this 4-part series. Some of you are still in the middle of watching and others have yet to watch, and I'm hoping that this live Q&A we have today will encourage you to take that step and tune into this programming. It's going to be so powerful if you haven't watched it, and if you have, you already know just how amazingly well done this has been, how brave the survivors were. Today, I have the honor of interviewing 2 people who were intricately involved in this documentary, Let Us Pray. The first is director Sharon Liese, and the second is Eric, one of our board members. I always say his last name a little bit wrong because I'm dyslexic, but it's Skwarczynski. So without further ado, we're going to bring them onto the stage here. Welcome, Eric and Sharon. Thank you so much, not only for your hard work on this film, but for taking the time to participate in this Q&A today.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. A for effort with the name, by the way.
Say it for us, Eric.
Skwarczynski. It's just like it's spelled. It just happens to be spelled in the most insane way. So
Skwarczynski. Okay, I'm going to keep working on it. But I'm really so honored to have the 2 of you here. And for everybody who's tuning in, this is a live Q&A. So I do have a couple of questions that I've already pulled from you all through the week, and I have a few of those written down, but I really want you all to participate live in this, and you can do that by dropping your questions in the comments underneath this video, and I will go through and I will pitch them and have the questions asked to each person as it is fit. And I'm just really hoping that you will take this as an opportunity that really is very special. You have the chance to see the documentary, but so few people have the opportunity to actually engage after, and you're being given that. So please drop all of your questions. There's no stupid questions. Just feel free to put them in the chat. Well, I think what I do want to start with is this really great question we got from Jandy. And I think I want to give it to you, Sharon. And what they were asking was, why should people watch this documentary? Maybe they're not from the IFB. Maybe they haven't even grown up in the church, or if they did, maybe they had a positive experience. Why should people tune into this documentary that you have helped create?
That is a great question. So what I learned in doing the documentary was something astounding to me, that there's an Independent Fundamental Baptist church probably in every neighborhood in the country. So there are an estimated 6,000 churches of IFB churches all around the country, with about 8 million members. So that's a lot of people and a lot of churches. And what I also learned is that if you just pointed anywhere in a map, you could probably find within 1 mile of that place that there'll be an IFB church. And in itself, it's not that significant, but when you know what many of them are doing and what many of the pastors are doing there, um, it's unbelievable, and people should know about it. We should know what's going on in our world, and it's like the Handmaid's Tale. Life is actually happening right now in real time, in our world and in our neighborhoods. So people should know about it.
Wow. Yeah, I think that is such a great way to answer that question. I know I grew up Independent Fundamentalist Baptist, and each church kind of has their own spin of toxicity, but they also have like these through lines, many of them. And so being able to see a documentary that really shows a lot of those through lines, the history, what is often being covered up. I mean, it's really a public service what you all have done. And I also wanted to take a minute. Could you tell people how you were first drawn to creating this project and directing it? You know, what was the thing that made you say, "Oh wow, this is something we've got to cover"?
I read a series of articles that were done by an investigative reporter, Sarah Smith, and
I was in
I
that
was
one.
yes, and I was shocked to learn about all the abuse that was happening in and around these churches. And they're not just churches. There's unregulated boarding schools, and there's daycare centers, and there's schools, and there's colleges. So there's lots of different places where this is happening. And not only is there abuse happening, but there are cover-ups. So once this is reported, nothing happens, and these pastors are getting shuffled around from church to church, and they just have another pool of victims to go after. So and I will say that it's not every single IFB church, but there are so many of them that it's unbelievably significant.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And Eric, I know that you started your podcast, years before this documentary came out, and it was probably motivated by some of those same things, but you also have personal experience. So what was kind of the thing that brought you into working on this specific project? Maybe talk a little bit about your background, what you do with your podcast, and like why this was a good fit for you to work on.
Yeah, it's funny because they kind of happened at the same time, unknowingly,
Okay.
like behind the scenes. I started the Preacher Boys podcast, obviously, with originally not a podcast of mine. I wanted to do a documentary approach. That was kind of my background. I just happened to be making religious documentaries prior to that. And I thought, what if I could take that and expose some of the religious abuse? And it just became a thing where the podcast blew up to a point where it didn't make sense for me to go pursue that. It's doubled down on telling stories of not just 3 or 4 people, but, new people every single week. And now almost 300 episodes of conversations on these topics. And while I was starting the Preacher Boys podcast, Sharon had read this article, started going through the process of researching this documentary in 2019. So I started my show in 2020. We connected midway through 2020 and just had a series of conversations. A lot of me asking, how are you approaching this? What are you going to do with it? And a lot of conversations from Sharon and Sam, who's the amazing producer on this, just going, what is this? Who's connected to who? Why did they do this? What was your experience? Who should we talk to? And so the way I got involved was really just them reaching out and being kind enough to ask me to be involved in the project. And in a really cool way, there's another layer of exposure beyond this. Like, we're all doing the same thing, whether it's Sarah Smith reporting in an article, whether it's me with the podcast, and now just happens to be an Emmy winning amazing director creating a project about it. Like, we're all getting to add these really cool pieces to the puzzle of exposing this kind of network.
Wow. That's really helpful to know how it kind of came through behind the scenes, and also to just kind of maybe give some people hope, because I'm sure for a long time, I know for a long time, people were like, why is nobody talking about this? Because I would have people say, oh, we're talking about the Southern Baptist Church. And that's very necessary. And it's not like a pitting different abusive environments against each other. Like, they're all, have problems. But even when you don't know how things could be in the works, like, a lot of times there's stuff behind the scenes happening, and survivors and advocates are very dedicated to making a loud noise. And so even if you don't see it on the surface, just know that there's always good people working to expose these abuses and to care for survivors. And you just kind of have to look, and you kind of have to dig deep, and sometimes ask a few questions to find it. But I'm just so thankful that this came out. I have a couple of questions here. And everybody, I just want to remind you to please, if you have any questions you want to drop, go ahead and do those in the comment section. I am going to be checking my phone to see if any have come through there, but I've not seen anybody drop something in the live video. So maybe if somebody would just put a comment in there, maybe even a thumbs up or something, so I can know those comments are coming through. But we're going to go to the next question. And this one is from Charles, and it is, how did the documentary change you? Going through that experience of working with the survivors, of producing this, directing this, telling the stories, how has it changed both of you?
Well, for me, it's definitely lit a fire in me, because every new person I spoke to and got to know, um, it was more it was more outrageous, and just was making me feel like I've got to do something. And I'm so happy that I'm able to amplify these voices. But it changed me in a way that, in not so good ways, in terms of the seeing how horrible people could be to other people, and manipulative. But it changed me in terms of hope, and in the strength of the women, and men that are involved in this project. Just knowing that they got so empowered by coming together and supporting each other, and there was healing, and there's activism, and I mean, even now that the series is out, it's like really, really confirmed to me the power of storytelling. And once these women have been able to tell their stories and feel like they are somewhat heard, they want to make sure that they're heard by the right people, the people that really hear them, and they're going after it.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. There's sort of that light and dark side of it. It's just sometimes when you get into these stories, you can just begin to see the depths of depravity, but also knowing that there's much darker things that probably still have to be uncovered. And then also, like, something that really inspired me about it was sort of at the end how the survivor women were hugging each other and just like, we will not, be silenced, and just like that, that freedom that they now have. There's just so many emotions that came from it, and I know it changed me watching it. It's really helpful to know how it changed you. Eric, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the movement itself wasn't foreign to me, but I think you know, the two biggest emotions I had were it was extremely validating that people, I was talking to Amanda Householder literally right before I hopped on this call, and I was talking about how, you know, within our circles of advocacy or in survivor circles or in former IFB, whatever group you find yourself in, we were talking about these subjects. It can feel sometimes like, well, we all get it. And it feels so normal, talking about things that are really abnormal.
Yeah.
And I think you can get that sense of, am I crazy? Was it as bad as I thought? Or do other people, would they see it as an issue, even though it affected me heavily? And I think it's validating to see someone like Sharon, who had no experience with this world before, stepping in and saying, no, this is very valid concerns and it needs to be talked about. And the world is going to care about these stories. I know for me, as someone who's tried to be a storyteller in this area, it was validating to see it get a larger platform and to be recognized by not just fellow survivors and advocates, but by the mainstream media. That was a huge step forward. The other thing for me was the emotion going through it was a high high and a low low. The high high being this is finally being seen, but that low low of there's a lot more work to be done. And I think channeling that rage and that anger that probably everyone felt watching to say, let's go do some protests. Let's go do some more advocacy. Let's work in 2024. My goal is to work with a lot more legislators and try to change some of the religious exemption laws and things like that. I think that's the next steps there. And I hope it had the same effect of lighting a fire under everyone else who watched the series.
Absolutely. And we actually got some questions specifically about like what we can do. And so there's two questions. I think they kind of go well together. But, what are some practical things we can do to stop the IFB in its tracks and shut them down? And then paired with that is what kind of legislation needs to be passed in order to protect people from abuse within churches, and how do we even go about that? So if either of you have some thoughts there, would love to hear them, because I know our audience is like, what can we do now?
Well, I'll go first. I think that talking to your legislators is really, really important, and you see that in the series, that the women in the Blind Eye Movement go and talk, and they have and are in getting some tiny steps toward statute of limitations, like changing those laws. Like that is a huge problem, because what people don't understand about victims of trauma is that victims of trauma are traumatized, and so they cannot talk about what happened to them for a while, if they ever can, and so they need that processing time. So if you put a ticking clock on that, and then you say, well, if it's in 20 years or 10 years or whatever the amount of time, you need to talk by then, or we won't believe you, or we can't do anything. It's just wrong. So there are states where that really needs to be changed and need to be addressed. And then the other thing,
something to that real quickly. It has always shocked me, like the statute of limitations things around abuse and sexual abuse and all those things, because it is so difficult to go to court and prove abuse, because it's usually a one-on-one thing, that if after 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, if you're able to have evidence to do that, like, how in the world can we turn those people away? Like, it is so hard to get a favorable win for survivors in many cases. But if you're able to go through that process and do that, why would time be the thing that would stop you? Like, that just, it blows my mind that that's how the system works. It's just so trauma informed.
Exactly. Yes, yes. And then there's so many other things you can do in terms of protests and activism and just within churches. When I was on a podcast with Ruthie, who's in our series, and she was saying, talking about like, why won't churches just invite survivors to come in and talk to the youth? Like, if they really are supportive of not allowing abuse, then why not have a survivor come in and talk about their experience and talk about what it means to what's inappropriate and what's appropriate when you're with when you're with a pastor or anybody. And so there's simple things that churches can do, and I think it's a big red flag when they're not doing that.
100%. Yeah. Eric, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing in this topic, and I mentioned, I really coming into this new year, one of the things that I discovered last year was that more than half of states have exemptions and loopholes for clergy reporting abuse. I always thought that every pastor is a mandated reporter. Over half of the US, that's not the case. There are loopholes for that. So that's something that I want to go after. But this goes to the practical thing for people who want to help. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to know how to do this. When I say I want to go after it, that means I'm calling lawyers that know how to do that. I'm calling legislators that know how to do that. I'm partnering with people who are already in the trenches. And so I think a lot of times, these things can become vanity projects, or it can be, hey, I want to start something and I want to cause the change. There's people already working, and sometimes it's better to join them in pushing the boulder than trying to find your own boulder to push. So look for organizations that you resonate with, that you love, advocacy groups that you resonate with and love, and link arms with them and follow those paths. Like, join on bills that are already going in a certain direction instead of trying to find someone to take on your exact approach. So yeah, I would just say do that. Like, find people that are great and connect with them and let them work in their strength and their power. Like, I'm not a legislator, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a podcaster, and I can get a message out. So I want to find people who have a message and amplify it instead of, beating my own drum all the time.
Right. That's really good. Another question about the way the production went. Like, you're telling such sensitive stories, giving a platform for survivors to tell such sensitive stories. Can you sort of give us a clue into like how you did that sensitively? Were there things in place to make sure survivors had resources and tools? And if you're not able to share that, that's fine. I know some things might need to be kept private, but I know some productions that I've worked with have had, therapists ready. What were some of the tools that you had in place to make this an empowering experience and not a re-traumatizing one?
That's a great question, an important question. And I'm also going to say that after I answer this, unfortunately, I'm going to have to get off this.
Okay. We'll keep
I'm
talking
enjoying.
with Eric.
Okay. But there were several things that happened. One was that we did have a psychologist available to talk to the women, usually during interview times, so that like they could call if they wanted to. It was also a very big learning experience for me, because I realized that when women are telling their stories about this, or any person who's talking about trauma they need time, and they may need to tell like a lot of detail, and a lot of detail that's hard to hear. And a lot of detail that we know we're not gonna put out there, because we're not gonna either be triggering to other people, or because they may reflect on it and think that they don't want all that detail out there anyway. But it was really important to hear their entire story so that we would know and get the and get the essence of everything that they were had experienced. Um, so that was really important. It was also important that we had a mostly female crew.
Yeah.
So our cinematographer, Yamit Sheminovitz, is very sensitive to trauma, and was great and got to know the women. And then also our sound recordist, most of the time was a woman, because this is a person who's got the headphones on and is listening to everything that is being said, and the person that has to interrupt you during an interview and say, a big truck just went by and you might need to have them say it. So that person is hearing very intimate details, and you could just be off in the corner. Also, is putting a mic on the women, so touching. So we felt that was really important. And when I say we, it was Sam and I, who was
Sure.
basically my partner throughout this whole process. Um, we also did something where we were really intentional about the environments that we had the interview space in, and talked to the women to make sure that we could collaboratively decide on what their space was. So in one instance, it was a woman who sat on a school bus because her part of her story was the bus ministry and the goldfish swallowing and things that had happened on the bus. And then, like, Amanda Householder was in an isolation room because her story was about what happened in Circle of Hope and unregulated boarding schools. So we really wanted the environments to be significant, but we also wanted them to be healing for the women. So we talked to them about reclaiming that space and kind of jointly determine what that space would look like, so that they could feel like they reclaimed it at the end of their interview.
Wow. I love just hearing the different safeguards that were put in place, and it sounds like it was done very consensually, and just being able to give somebody a platform to share their own voice, but doing it in such a way that's just so sensitive. I think that's a rarity in media a lot of times, but something that's becoming more prevalent because of people like you. And, I know Sarah Smith and Sarah Stenkorb, and, just so many people in media who have this trauma sensitive lens. It's really making a difference and letting people share in a way that is empowering versus re-traumatizing. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for noticing that, because we need women, and we need people who stories to tell their stories. And and I do feel a major responsibility in honoring those stories, and being being the vessel that can help amplify these stories. So it really is a great honor when people trust you with their stories.
Absolutely. And I know you have to go, but everybody still hang on. We're going to continue talking with Eric. Sharon, I'm just so thankful for your hard work, and I hope we can connect up in the future. Just really want to support any projects that you're doing, because I have absolutely been blown away and impressed by this one. So thank you for your time with us and for answering our questions. Really, really appreciative.
Thank you for having me, and you're in great hands with Eric, as you know.
Absolutely. Eric, we have a couple questions that have come through for us, and one is specifically for you. It says, Eric, do you see an uptick in recent years of more men getting involved in this advocacy work? Would this make a deeper impact?
Yeah, I've definitely seen more that have come forward or talked about it. I think it's still a small portion. And the only way that more are going to come forward is for more to come forward, because I think it is a snowball effect. With any abuse story, seeing someone who shares the same story gives you that confidence to be able to come out and share your own. And I think that's the importance of all the people you mentioned, Sarah Smith, Sarah Stancorp's book, with the podcast, with other shows like this. I think it's very important. But I think there's just a lot we have to unpack to make people feel comfortable approaching it, especially coming out of fundamentalist environments. For males already culturally, the stats say it's difficult for them to come forward with abuse stories. I think when you start layering in, male on male abuse and homophobia within fundamentalism, like there's a lot of layers there that I've heard privately in conversations that affect the decision to come out. So there's a lot there. Yes, I've seen an increase in it, you know, of people coming forward, but it's still, there's a lot of work we need to do to make people feel comfortable in that arena. But I'm hoping that will change over time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm also curious, I know this same person who asked this question, Michelle Miner, she also wanted to know about your experience as a man working in a female dominated production with female survivors and being an advocate in that space, what that was like for you. And in addition to men speaking out about their own trauma, it also seems like there's fewer amounts of men speaking up about abuse in general on behalf of other people.
Mhm.
And I've come across a lot of men in the advocacy space who have listened to women advocates for years, then basically try to take their platforms and use it as like a, see, I'm safe. And, it's more of like a,
Mhm.
it's a PR move and a crushing and stepping on the women advocates. I've seen that a lot. I don't see that with you. And so I'm wondering, like, what was your experience like, and how can men speak up about abuse in general, even if it's not their own, in a way that is supportive of survivors who have come forward, knowing that a lot of them are women?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is just listening, and like I said earlier, I think it's letting people who are doing the work
Mm,
share and amplify it. And I think sometimes the instinct for everybody is there's an issue, let me step in and solve it. And I think there's already incredible people who are. And so if it's not something you've experienced directly, I think the best thing to do is to help amplify the voices of people who are sharing. If something did happen to you directly, I think try to find people that you're comfortable sharing with. It doesn't have to be a big public platform because that's not for everybody. And that could be a terrible decision for some people to do. But if in terms of people who have not experienced abuse that want to be better allies and advocates, I think it's just literally, if someone posts something, share it. If someone does an interview, listen to it. If someone is in a documentary series where they talk about the worst part of their life, I think the best thing you could do, or the least you could do, is to listen and hear it and reflect on it, and then turn and say, what am I doing to contribute in a negative or positive way to these issues?
mm,
And start making change within your home, your churches, your community, and so on and so forth.
right. That's really good. And this is the follow-up question from me. Was there anything that you specifically learned for yourself as a man in working with women on a project like this that maybe you saw in a new light, or um, sensitized you more? I'm just curious if there was any things you learned from that experience in particular.
Yeah, I think, Sharon mentioned, the sound recordist being a female,
Hmm.
listening to everybody talk, and the cinematographer being sensitive to that. And, I asked her the question when I interviewed her, why is it important to tell female stories through a female lens? And I said, the answer is kind of obvious when you ask the question.
Not to
But
everyone.
it is, right. But it's something where, the way that we approach these stories, so often we tend to, especially I think as creatives, we tend to
Mhm.
look at things through our lens, and we
Yeah.
tend to say, how would I frame this story? And I
Right.
think what Sharon did really well, and I don't know if it's I mean, just learning from her and how she approached it, where it's giving women a chance to reclaim the spaces that were taken, and
Mm.
not just doing what necessarily, the documentary looks beautiful, but she wasn't just thinking, how do I make a beautiful shot, or how do I ask a good question, or how do I get a good soundbite? It
Yeah.
was, how do I empower them in telling their story? And so I think just it ratcheted up that
Mm.
sensitivity, and it ratcheted up that idea of it's their story, not
Yeah.
the productions. And I think Sharon did
Mhm.
a great job in doing that, where, you know, the locations of the interviews were so thoughtful. The way that they assembled the crew was so thoughtful. And the way that they approached everything was always, how do we make this a comfortable experience for the person who's doing something extremely uncomfortable. And
Right.
even with me, not even just with this, the survivors and the women they were dealing, but even my experiences with them, like they were
Mhm.
so focused on making sure that, everything was a positive experience. And I think that shows in the level of depth that they were able to get into, because nobody shut themselves off
Right.
through that process.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, that's really, really good. Um, and everybody, I'm checking the chat and I'm trying to get to as many questions as possible. If I have missed your question, just go ahead and copy and paste it and repost it, and I'll get to it. I'm trying to get through all of these here. Um, yeah, lots of good interaction. Another question that I received the other day was, if there's any systems or group for ongoing support and education and advocacy for survivors. And I know Courage 365 is one of those, and
No, that's
you're
a good one. Recommend that.
yeah, you're on the board, and you know, um, I think that I've heard you um, talk about why you enjoy working with Courage and
Mhm.
how doing actual advocacy work. It's not just a show, there's resources. What are
Right.
some of the things that you feel like maybe from our organization could potentially be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think, I mean, and I'm biased because this is kind of my approach, but I think there's so much benefit to just hearing the stories and getting
Yeah.
in groups like this. I think the biggest thing, when I mentioned earlier about like validation, I think
Mm-hmm.
getting around people who have been there and done that, as difficult as that is,
Right.
getting around people who understand it is important. But I also think in equal measure, it can be
Mm-hmm.
easy to sit in groups like that and be comfortable with just, oh, that was really bad. I think also
Right.
getting around people who don't have context for it, or people
Mm-hmm.
who are totally disconnected from that world,
Sure.
can be very helpful as well. So I would say just finding community, I know the Courage clubs have been really helpful for people. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's like a great resource to not feel alone. But I
Yeah.
think for those that aren't rushing to get into that kind of situation quickly,
Right.
just watching things like this, listening to materials like it, and then giving yourself time to breathe and digest it, instead of just
Mm-hmm.
having the fire hose on of just education, constantly, like taking some time to reflect and apply.
That makes sense. And for people listening, if you're kind of recognizing that, wow, this was an impactful documentary, and I feel like I need to kind of process some of the things that I've experienced. As Eric mentioned, we do have the Courage Clubs, which are peer support groups. And right now, we do have a waiting list for when we start those again in the new year. There is currently a group running right now, but we go through a curriculum, and so we're kind of in the process of that. But we'll be starting some again, I think as soon as January. And so if you are interested in being in like a intimate Zoom support group type situation with facilitators who are very qualified with curriculum to go through, it's free. You can go to courage365.org, and click the clubs tab, and there is a waiting list that you can add yourself to. And we would really love if that would be a support to you for you to join. Again, it's free. And then we have other tools on our website. Like maybe this brought up a lot of triggering feelings for you. Well, we have a trauma reduction toolkit that has flashcards that you can, after you read the little book and watch the little video, you can have these flashcards. And when you're triggered and you don't know what to do, like, oh, let me try this one. And this can kind of help calm my body, or give it to a supportive friend or partner to kind of remind you. And so we have those things. We have a how to find a therapist free resource. And it talks about how you can find free therapy or low cost therapy. So if you are looking for resources, I think just going to courage365.org and clicking our free tab, there's a lot of stuff there. But if you're watching this and you're not inside our Facebook group, that's where a lot of people do connect with each other and have times where they share something they're struggling with, and other survivors come to support them, or we stream important conversations like this in there. So that's just Courage 365 group. We've got a public page, but then there's the private page if that would feel supportive to you as well. I am just trying to look through some of these questions here. For some reason, it's not showing me everything. Let me, let's see. Okay, here we go. Now it's letting me open it up. Oh, this is a good question from Dominique. It says, any plans for more seasons in the future? Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I mean, fingers crossed here. I mean, I know the series has gotten a lot of good attention. The way it's going to happen is just people watching and sharing and showing that there's an interest in it.
Yeah.
That's what Sharon kind of shared with me, was just more attention. It seems like it's doing well. Hit number 7 on Max, which is probably a good sign, and they're probably happy to see that. But yeah, I mean, just make it known that you want a season 2. Keep sharing it. Same thing, just amplify the voices that are there. And we're all hopeful because there's a lot more stories to share beyond the ones that were. There's other layers to stories, a lot left on kind of a spot of in the middle of a story. Kathy, is just about to go back to, trial dates and things for her lawsuit coming in January. Pretrial starts then. So there's a lot. I mean, I think it's just a matter of amplifying and tweeting and using that hashtag let us pray, and making the network know that you want to see more of this, because these do, at the end of the day, unfortunately cost a lot of money, I'm sure. And so just making it known. But beyond that, it's not the final chapter either way. Like, there's lots of people who are sharing stories. There's gonna be a protest this weekend in Indiana at First Baptist that's going to be documented by a lot of people. So just keep supporting these stories wherever you see them, and whether it ends up being a season 2, a different documentary, different crew of people, like anything you see, just support with your your eyes, and a free trial of a subscription service goes a long way. So
Yeah. Charles asked a really good question, something that I've definitely thought about a lot, and it is, why do you feel the jail terms are so short? I know that I came away not only with the stories in the documentary, but honestly, most people who go to jail for sex crimes against children, so many times the sentences are like 2 years when you get parole. And, I think one of the abusers was going away for potentially 40 years, which is a lot better. But still, when you contrast that against, what a survivor has to carry for the rest of their lives, why do you think there's so many short-term sentences for such destructive behaviors?
yeah, I think some of it's education. I think it's, a lot of these stories, I think judges are sitting there and they're weighing out stories where, they don't understand the level of manipulation, especially within religious contexts. So there's some of that. I think some of it's just weak laws on some of these topics, like a law that protects someone who meets in high school and gets married and there's an age gap. Like, that's not the same thing as a 17-year-old and a 24-year-old youth pastor who's their spiritual leader. Like, that's a there's a lot of layers to that abuse that come into play. But the other thing I'll say on that, this is actually something that I never considered until doing an interview with Rachel, who's in the series. And because I mentioned something about, the short-term sentences. And look, that's something everyone's frustrated with. I think that's something that survivors talk about being frustrated with. But she said something that it kind of changed my perspective. And she said, a lot of times after the sentence, people would ask me like, "Oh, I can't believe he only got this much time," or "I can't believe." And she said that actually really bothered her because she fought so hard to get any kind of justice. And she said, instead of people celebrating that, they would just be frustrated that it was so short. And she said, and that's a topic for a day. But she said, it just instantly made me feel like, oh, did I do something wrong? Did I not push hard enough to get him more time? When clearly that's not in their power. So that was a big reframe there. I would say for people watching, like, that's something because I used to ask that all the time and say that. And it always came out to me as like, oh, I'm with you. Like, this is my show of support. But I would say it's something that I think we need to take a lot of action on and push for legislative change to expand the sentences, but also recognizing that, some of these guys that get 2 years, these survivors went through hell to give them those 2 years. And so supporting the survivor and giving them that closure while also behind the scenes, really fighting hard to expand those sentences. And I think that comes through education. Again, it all goes back to amplifying those stories.
Right. And it is relative because it may be an old statistic, but I think it was from RAIN that said like 1 out of 1,000 rapists actually sees a day in prison. And so the survivor is able to have their perpetrator spend any time in prison, even if it is very little, like that is a huge win on their
It's a win. Yeah.
Though I would also say, if a survivor is not able to have that happen, whether that's because they're not at a place where they can speak up or testify, whether that's statute of limitations or a poor court system, like that's not their fault either. And so just always coming back to like, it's not on the survivor what does or doesn't happen to the abuser, and we can fight for longer sentences and celebrate the wins for survivors. Like those are kind of two separate things, and sometimes we eclipse the survivor wins over our frustration of the light sentences. And yeah, that's a good perspective. Let me see another question here. Let's see. A lot of people are really thankful for this. Okay. How can we get this back in the public eye? The media seems uninterested. And I do think, Charles, that's a good question because it does seem like things happen in waves. And so there'll be like attention for like, what is it, the 48-hour news cycle, sometimes a 24-hour news cycle.
1 hour
12-hour
news cycle.
Yeah, like how do we leverage when the kind of big waves come, and also at the same time, like when there's lulls, like get momentum to get it back up again, whether that's through documentary or something else?
Yeah. And I that is a really good question. And I think it is something that can be frustrating because I know it can feel like nothing's happening. But I think it's kind of like what we just talked about with Sharon is that I started the podcast in 2020. Sharon started pre-production on Let Us Pray in 2019. So you're looking at a big wave in 2023 with Let Us Pray coming out. Again, it got a lot of attention from a lot of big outlets that had never covered it before. But that's 4 years of work on a project that is, if you want to break it into 4 episodes over 4 years, but obviously that's not how it plays out, but like that's how much time goes into those 45, 42-minute episodes that you're seeing. And so I would say don't be discouraged that nothing's happening, because sometimes the times it's quietest. I know in my show, there's been times it's been very quiet where I've been working like a madman behind the scenes to push something along that's important. Sometimes that's stuff that's literally, you know, I mean, in the last couple of years, there's been times I've helped, connect a survivor to a lawyer who's now seeing justice in their case. You'll never know their name and you'll never know about that case. And I can never talk about some of those stories, but they've happened. And so, yes, support this stuff when it comes out, but don't be discouraged when you don't see something, because sometimes it's just building. Something's building in the background, something's coming along. And I think the way to leverage these waves is, again, the beauty of Let Us Pray is it introduced you to people like Rachel. It introduced you to people like Kathy. For some, it probably introduced them to me for the first time. For some, for Amanda Householder in the troubled teen industry. So now you've been introduced, like, don't wait for season 2 to keep supporting them. Like, go find their individual pages. Go find, Ruthie with the Blind Eye Movement. Like, their page is shot up, which is fantastic. It's gone to like 2,000, 3,000 people following now. Like, support them on the ground. And they're doing some of the work that's, it's the boring. I was just talking to Amanda Householder. It's the boring work. It's the meetings with legislators. It's the bills. It's the stuff that really, like, it doesn't sound really sexy, but it's really important and causes real change. Like, go find a way to support. You don't have to support all of us. You don't, like, my podcast isn't for everybody, but maybe Amanda's work is worth following for you, So find someone to support and just help them keep the message going, even when it's not backed by studio dollars and a premium streaming network and a director who has other projects that they need to work on, in the future. Like, it's finding and equipping the people who are already speaking.
That makes sense. And one other thing I would say, a way to build momentum is stop giving your tithes to churches who are abusing or covering up abuse. Start giving that money to survivor organizations that are really making an impact and changing people's lives.
Right.
We've got to stop funding the opposition, and take whatever guilt or indoctrination, like, work through that around tithes and giving money. And if you are the type of person that is still in a faith community, I'm not saying you shouldn't be, but look at it from that perspective. Like, Jesus was over there knocking over tables when people were given, exchanging money in the wrong ways. And we need to stop, whether we're in the church or out of the church, funding organizations that are hurting people, and not just removing the money entirely and just keeping it to ourselves, but replacing that and putting it in good places. Because just because we remove some money from a bad organization doesn't mean a good organization. And it doesn't just have to be Courage, though we would thank you for your donations. We really need them. But whether it's RAIN or, whatever it is, it costs money to do this work. And that money isn't easy to get. Like, you have to fund the movement for movement to keep happening, because we live in a capitalist society. So if you want to make a difference, if you want to make change, there are things you can do on, calling your legislators, those types of things. But sometimes we're just not skilled in certain areas. There's certain things that I don't do, I can't do, but I give money to people who can. And so that would be something I would think about. If you're not in a place in your healing journey where you're like, oh, I want to go to protests and call my legislators, focus on you. Focus on your survivor care first and foremost. And then for people who haven't been abused and are just like, oh, it's the Christmas season, let me give away to, look where the charities are you're donating to and what's actually happening behind the scenes, and give it to people that are actually going to make a difference and keep these waves going. That's just a little bit of a soapbox, I guess, but stop tithing to the opposition. That's where it's going. One thing that I wondered if we could talk about a little bit is I I think this is a documentary that felt the most triggering to me. It hit the most home to me because I grew up IFB. I watched the Duggar documentary, and that was very hard hitting as well. But this one was deeper. And one of the things that I saw with the IFB Church is just how independent it is, and how there are these through lines, but there's also these unique weirdo things that each church may have different. And so there'll be certain beliefs that kind of track through, but then there'll be other stuff that maybe a church does, but another church doesn't do. And I'm just curious, in your hearing of these stories, what's kind of your opinion on the movement as a whole? Like, are we really able to hit it, just from one angle, or is it so unique that we have to use a lot of different hammers from different angles?
Right. Yeah, I think the most harmful things are a through line through all of them. And so we can address those. I think the quirks and the strangeness and the does your church swallow goldfish on the bus, kind of thing, like those things are unique, or like the pastor's own hangups on certain things are unique. But I think the basic, the way women are treated in almost all of these churches, almost all these churches, it's something that can be addressed in a broad way. The lack of respect for, proper legal channels in these cases is something that can be addressed in all of them. One of the lines that I said in the series that has gotten the most negative feedback in any IFB pastor that's reviewed it, or anybody who's still faithful to that world, is I said, every IFB church is a powder keg ready to explode. And that doesn't mean that every church has exploded or even will explode. What that means is that the system is set up in a way where abuse can happen and happen easily.
Yeah.
And so when you have one person, one pastor who runs everything and has ultimate power, you're going to have some good pastors who lead like a kind king of the church. And then you're going to have another pastor come in right after them in the same system. And because they're a bad guy, they have everything they need to abuse. And when you have women not allowed to use their voice in any context beyond just the preaching conversation, like in any context, to be able to speak up when they feel like something's wrong, you're leaving it open to abuse.
Yeah.
When kids are taught you're the property of your parents and you're less valuable because of your age, they're set up for abuse. So, oh God, you can,
lightning bolts
we
coming
can talk.
down on you from
I
that.
know. You start talking about it, you're struck down. But you have a lot you can talk about. You have a lot you can talk about and a lot you can get into before even touching like the quirky standards about music and movie theaters and all that, which is fun to talk about. Trust me, I'll gather around a campfire and talk about those stories.
Yeah.
But there's some broad beliefs that span
Yeah.
the entire movement that need to be addressed. And again,
Absolutely.
my goal is that the good guys, the good pastors that do exist, who just happen to believe some interesting things I don't, like, they should be willing to have conversations to make those changes and to recognize maybe I need some more accountability. Even though I'm not going to do something, that's a good thing to set up for future generations. Maybe my kids need more of a voice. Maybe women should be given. I heard of a pastor wanting to do a abuse conference, but he didn't want to have any female survivors speak. It's like, well, dude, what are we doing? Like that doesn't make much sense. So I would advise all that, and I would advise not coughing in the middle of a question. So that's
Yeah, and what you said there stood out to me about maybe this pastor is a nice king of this church, but then he steps
Yep.
down. He has this throne set up so the mean king can sit. It's what I talked about the other week on. I was in a conference setting of a Leaning Forward conference, and I was talking about hardcore patriarchy and softcore patriarchy.
Right.
And so it's, at the end of the day, it can accomplish the same thing, whether you say it with a nice voice or a mean voice. Because, hardcore patriarchy is like, women submit, I'm going to slap you over the face. And, it's just very like aggressive. But then softcore patriarchy is like, women should humbly submit of their own accord. And, it's just like this flowery language. And
It
if you
sounds
don't,
nicer, but
it
it's not.
sounds nicer, but at the end of the day, it's still, you'll be punished by God or by the church or by your husband or whatever if it doesn't happen. And I feel like that's a very similar parallel to these church structures, is when you give somebody this much authority and pedestal and the rules that are created in this group, even if the person using the rules has a soft voice, it can be just as damaging. I personally know of a pastor who is very well liked. He is extremely charismatic and fun, and he's covered up so much abuse. And just because you have this nice face and you're not one of the Hiles that's always like screaming from the pulpit, if that's not your style, you can still be incredibly damaging. And it's
Well,
not
it's
always the tone.
well, not to keep circling explosions, but it really it's the difference between a gas leak. Like, you can die from a gas leak and you could die from an explosion. Both are deadly. One takes a little bit longer to identify. Maybe it goes by unnoticed, but I'm saying it really is like the pastor at First Baptist Church of Hammond right now has kept a lot of the same people employed who did help kind of cover for guys like Jack Scott. But he's not as bombastic and he's very soft spoken, but the theology is still there. The system is still there. And there's a slow gas leak killing people versus the large explosions that are a lot easier. It's almost safer and better when these guys are clumsy and loud and, make a big scene, because it's easier to spot them. It's a lot harder to spot the smaller, quieter kind of voices.
Right. And kind of in that analogy, I have like this little quirk where I like to read like ghost stories and things like that. And what I've seen of a lot of the science is that a lot of times when people think there's a ghost or spirit in their house, there's actually like a leak or some kind of toxic gas that causes them to hallucinate. And they think that there's something wrong with them, but it's really the environment that they're in is polluting them slowly. And so they're seeing these apparitions, and it's not really a ghost, but it is this environment they're in. And that also kind of seems like it goes in with that analogy, because a lot of times the quieter ones, they're more tricky in the way they make you think it's your fault and you're the one going crazy. Because it's not the big explosion that you can point to and say, hey, here's this bruise, or hey,
You're
look
being a jerk. It's a lot more sinister and secretive.
The mind and anyway, I didn't think we'd be talking about that, but I love
If you see a ghost in your house, call the gas department and come check.
Yes, absolutely. Anyway, well, Eric, thank you so much for this. In case somebody has not seen the documentary yet and they want to, where can they find it?
Yeah, you can stream anywhere you have access to Investigation Discovery. You can watch it. It's an Investigation Discovery program. It's available on Max. That's their main partnership. So check out Max. I think you're able to do a free trial of the channel through Amazon Prime. There's ways to find it. Like, just Google ways to get access to Investigation Discovery. I think Discovery Plus has a trial. You can watch it, but Max is the main place you can check it out. That would be the best.
Yeah. Well, everybody, thank you for your questions and for participating in this. Please continue to share about the documentary. That again helps the possibility of another season or other production companies to be able to point to it and say, see, this was successful. We can do other stories similar to this. Just it helps keep the survivor stories going, and the more eyes we have on this, the easier it is to get more eyes on it, if it makes sense. So just keep sharing it. And go check out the different survivors on on the show and the work that they're doing, the Blind Eye Project, and just support the work that they're doing, because this was incredibly difficult. Yes, it's a win that they got to be on TV, but they got to be on TV because of some of the worst days of their lives. So keep supporting them through this, because I can only imagine. Brene Brown talks about the vulnerability hangover and how you share something vulnerably and then afterwards you're like, oh my gosh, I need to like hide in a hole. And like, I'm not speaking for how they feel, but I can only imagine that in the coming months, over years, that they'll continue to want to have your support and backing. So please do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's all the questions that we are going to take for today. Eric, where can people find you and your podcast?
Yeah, and it probably will answer any questions you have somewhere in the like 300 episodes. So just listen to all of them, please, and you should get the answers. If you haven't connected already, the Preacher Boys podcast, wherever you listen to shows, and if you watch on YouTube, um, everything for the most part is over there as well. There's a billion ways. If you search any variation of me and my name or Preacher Boys, you'll find that
And
right
say your name
away.
again. Spell it. Spell
Eric
it.
Skwarczynski. If you type in Eric SKW, you'll probably find something. But yeah, Preacher Boys anywhere, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, the podcast version. And like I said, it's no hard feelings if my content's not right for you. Again, support, Courage 365, very different tone. It's one of the reasons I wanted to partner with Ashley is, there's a tone that's very different. My tone's very confrontational. I think Courage is very, it's a lot more warm and focused on, the recovery side. So it's all needed. It's all parts of the same puzzle, like I said. And so find what works for you. If it happens to be my show, I'd love to connect. And even if you support the show and don't want to listen to it, I understand that too. Like, it's a heavy topic, but it's very important. So, yeah, there you go. That's me.
All right, guys. Thank you so very much. Eric, it was a pleasure having you here. I know we'll have you again. And yeah, we've got some cool things that are coming up in 2024 for the Courage community. So stay tuned. Sending you all so much love. And as always, live with courage.